So again, just in the bullring here today, exposing the unfruitful works of darkness, which is what we're commanded to do as Christians, is to come into the world as exposing darkness for the benefit of mankind, because the devil gets into the government, he gets into men in government, and he starts manipulating the writings so that he can usher in further degrees of debauchery and try to hide the crime and conceal the criminal nature of the conduct of the men he has positioned. So, to preface, they have written legislations behind your back, and they haven't satisfied the democratic processes so to do. So these legislations are designed to create the facade that certain things can be done in specific offices, which would allow the people in those offices to fail to do their jobs according to the brief of that office. So, for example, the President now believes, according to legislation that you had nothing to do, corrupting legislation and corrupt legislation, that in both how it was come about and its effects, they're claiming that the President of Ireland doesn't have to check the constitutionality of bills prior to enacting them into the legislation. Now, why is this mindless? It's mindless because in order to have certainty that what is in the writings is lawful, you need to test it and compare it to the Constitution. Now, the President of Ireland is custodian of the Constitution. He's learned in constitutional law, and if he's not, he should be, as custodian of the Constitution. So he's not in ignorance as to what the Constitution is, what it says, or what it's designed to do. He knows the spirit of the Constitution. He knows that it's to preserve harmlessness within society and reasonableness in business. And so it's not reasonable or harmless for the President to take money under false pretenses, claiming to be custodian of the Constitution and failing to test the bills for their constitutionality. You cannot do both. You cannot fail to test bills for their constitutionality and be custodian of the Constitution, now can you? Because the custodian of the Constitution is tasked principally with implementing the Constitution and ratifying as to whether bills are constitutional or not, even prior to considering them otherwise as beneficial for society. They have to first and foremost be constitutional and not fight against the basic or fundamental precepts of our Constitution and of the law in order to be even considered for addition to the writings. Anything else would be highly unreasonable conduct. Okay, so these legislations, which I will outline in this, and the effects of them and what they profess in this video, you have to preface that they were come about unlawfully. The Irish people were not consulted about these legislations. They are basically corrupting. They go against logic and reason and the fundamentals of the Constitution of Ireland. And so they actually attempt to nullify the actual role of the office that they're designed to target. So, for example, telling the President he doesn't have to act like a custodian is pretty much attacking Ireland and compromising the certainty surrounding the writings as to whether they're lawful or not. And so obviously this is detrimental to our society. It's not good for the common good, and it is sedition because it attempts to overthrow the Constitution. In effect, you don't have to come with a gun to effectively overthrow something, but it is crime when you come about the writings unlawfully. Now, you might claim they didn't come about them unlawfully, but any legislation that fundamentally fights against the Constitution of Ireland is a crime. It's a crime to leave it in place. Do you see the point? It is a crime for the President to embark upon conduct which is opposed to his principal task within his office. And to accept legislation can do so is another crime on the part of the President. See, you can try to pretend you have impunity because somebody else wrote a legislation and you didn't write it yourself, but that's not how government works. Each individual official has an oath of office that they are duty bound to preserve. If they find that anything opposes that brief of office or alters the fundaments of that office in its effectiveness, they are duty bound to bring that to the attention of the courts designed to remove any ambiguity surrounding those matters. What's interesting is it's the President who's supposed to first and foremost test as a prerequisite measure the constitutionality of bills prior to their enactment or inclusion. Now, if they're not doing that, if they're not checking the bills for their constitutionality prior to their addition to the writings, they are failing as our government. Now, the President of Ireland as custodian is the one who is tasked principally and singularly with that testing of the constitutionality of bills. So if he fails to do that at the beginning stages, at the early stages as a prerequisite, he is failing the country, he is fighting against the country, and he should be considered, in my educated opinion, based on what I've said, as enemy of the state. Because if you are pretending to be the preserver of the Constitution and you're not going through the motions of preserving it, then you are enemy of the state. Because the Constitution is that which gives us our certainty in law, our certainty in rights, our certainty in responsibility, and our certainty in the common good and the family unit. So, if he's not doing his principal task and what is fundamental to the preservation of our society, he is the enemy, singularly, of the state. Now, he can't blame others in government for legislating things that he knows are fundamentally constitutionally wrong and opposed to the Constitution as custodian of the Constitution. He doesn't have that privilege because he's custodian of the Constitution. So he has to safeguard against anything that gets into the writings at any stage from any party. That's his principal task. So it is solely the responsibility of the President. But he can use the faculty. He can use the courts. He can apply or employ the courts and their intellect or their knowledge or their faculty at any stage that he wants to, which is at the onset as a prerequisite condition to adding bills to legislation for their constitutionality. So he doesn't lack, if he lacks any acumen or knowledge himself, he can always apply to the court for further counsel. Now, but it still remains solely his responsibility at the initial stages. And so if something did get into legislation that was unconstitutional, he wouldn't be excused in that. He's not excused in that. That is a misconduct. It's an error on his part. Now, if he was to chase it up, one might say, well, he noticed it and got rid of it. But what the government are now doing is they're fighting against you having clarity in whether your legislations are constitutional or not. And that is fundamentally opposed to the well-functioning of Irish society. So another thing that the legislation pretends is that the President of Ireland, if found in misconduct, is not answerable to the courts of Ireland. Now, that's absolutely reprehensible. It's reprehensible. That couldn't be the case. It couldn't be the case that the one wielding the authority, caretaker of the Constitution, with one of the most, if not the most pivotal role in Ireland, most important role in Ireland, regarding the preservation of the Constitution, it wouldn't be acceptable that if he wields the authority of that office, that he wouldn't be subject to the authority of that office. He wouldn't be subject to the authorities of Ireland. He wouldn't be subject to the courts if found in misconduct. That wouldn't be reasonable, because the one who is most endowed with a very important role needs to be most accountable, not least accountable. Okay? So it's like a head chef in the kitchen is the one you go to if you get food poisoning. He might go to the commis chef, but you don't. You go to the head chef because he's accountable, because he has the most authority, therefore the most responsibility, therefore the most accountability. The President of Ireland is one of the most responsible, so he is holds the most accountability, but he's claiming he doesn't have accountability to the courts. So how does the President of Ireland not have accountability for his misconduct to the courts of Ireland? That's obviously unconstitutional. It's obviously against his oath of office. It's obviously against the precepts and fundaments of Irish law. It's obviously opposed singularly to accountability. Now, it's no coincidence that first they would try to give you the impression that the president doesn't have to check bills for their constitutionality, and then tell you he's not accountable if found in misconduct, because they're always at every stage trying to create the illusion that they have impunity or blamelessness for their evil actions. And they are evil because they're harmful. You see, it's harmful to take money from people under false pretenses. Do you see? So, thirdly, if you find that a legislation is unconstitutional, if you find that there's something in the writings that fight against your rights or the laws of the land, you as an Irish citizen, well, first, I would say you're duty bound. There is a responsibility upon you to expose that, isn't it? Yeah. So if you've done that, if you've exposed it, where do you go? You go to the High Court. So if you go to the High Court and the High Court say, yeah, we'll test that section, that warrants a test, right? And then they go about calling their barristers, and you call your barrister, and you go about testing the constitutionality of those sections. And then they say, well, we're going to abandon that test, and they don't even tell you that they've abandoned it as the one bringing the test. Like, I brought a test, my barrister brought a test, my solicitor, my lawyer brought a test, and what happened? They abandoned the test, and nobody told me, the one whose name is being used in the case, was not notified that the test was being abandoned mid-case. That's the level of corruption. So they're saying that the President is custodian of the Constitution. They're saying as an Irish person you have access to test the constitutionality of legislature if you find it unconstitutional. But then in effect, they're removing your access to your rights and committing treason. It is treason to remove the rights of access and to fail to carry out the duty, what you're duty bound to carry out as an official in government, in court, in government, as a politician or whatever it is, whatever organ of state you're a member of. It is a crime to fail to carry out your task when you know better. And they know better. They're not in ignorance here. They are deliberately refusing to do what they are constitutionally duty bound to do, what they're paid to do. So they abandoned the test and said nothing. They gave no excuse, no reason for abandoning the test, and didn't even notify me, the one who brought the test. It was up on courts.ie before I even heard about it. The conclusion of the court. So that would show you how corrupt these people are. Absolutely, fundamentally corrupt. And they're trying to write these legislations which are fundamentally opposed to their own offices. And they're happy enough to accept that they're valid without any further testing. But what's furthermore, after the President failed to test the constitutionality of legislation and he refuses to take responsibility and accountability and submit to the courts on that account, the High Court then failed to test the constitutionality also and gave no excuse for so doing. Then there was an appeal to the Court of Appeal, and what happened? They were to judicially review what the High Court did, or failed to do for that matter. They were to complete the tasks that the High Court were assembled to complete and failed to. That's what a judicial review is. They have to review the entirety of the case. And they elected, instead of testing the constitutionality of the sections again, they elected to command the Irish people to presume legislation constitutional instead of carrying out and completing the test. So now the Irish people are being ordered by a corrupt government to consider that whatever they write and whatever they say is lawful, even though they're not bothering their Barney to test it. Not bothering, and they don't even feel duty bound so to do, and they're not even trying to conceal their failure to carry out their office. That's how blatant and boldly corrupt and criminal they are. The Court of Appeal in Ireland, three Court of Appeal judges, well experienced, well paid men, saw that the injustices were perpetrated against my person for up to the tune of a month in prison, wrongful imprisonment, saw that and ruled that and agreed that my liberties were wrongfully removed for 2 years in the way of freedom of speech, and ruled that in my favour. And do you know what they did? No compensation, no restitution, no reparation. even though they're constitutionally duty bound again to do so, to motion for this reparation, this compensation. Nothing, not a cent, not a write-up, nothing. They're supposed to restore good name. As far as I can remember, but not even a write-up in the paper, in the Irish Times, and all the papers where they said, this man, boo, you know. And then when they found out that this man wasn't guilty, you know. So at every stage and at every level and on every front, they're absolutely fighting against the constitutional rights of the Irish people. They couldn't care about them. They're legislating behind the Irish people's back that the president's not accountable for his misconduct. I mean, how ridiculous, right? The criminal not responsible for the crime. But as custodian of the Constitution, his principal task is caretake the law. Make sure nothing gets into the writings that fights the law, that fights the Constitution, in other words. Right? So that's what he's doing. He is enemy of the state. And whoever legislated to create the facades around him, he conspires with, because he knows better. He knows better. He knows that his role is to preserve the Constitution. He knows better. He's without excuse. He's studied in constitutional law. He knows better than any of us. But he's doing it anyway. He's doing it anyway. Why do you think that is? Because he is involved with the Freemasons, and they are a corrupt cabal who are trying to hand Ireland over to Europe and over to the New World Order and over to the corporate conglomerate. That's why they're buying potatoes from Spain. That's why they're not producing as much food in Ireland, and it's all for export beef, the majority of it. That's why only 1% of farmers are producing vegetables in Ireland, and they're buying spuds from Spain. Because they're trying to impoverish the Irish people in terms of infrastructure so that they can hand them over to other people for their provision, so that they become less than slaves. And once they've done this and formed it, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Yeah? So, pipe down there, say. So, the constitutionality of legislation is the responsibility of the President to ensure, establish. If there's any ambiguity, to call the faculty together to remove that ambiguity or remove that legislation. He's duty bound to do that. Now, obviously, legislation that tells him he doesn't have to do his job is criminal. It's criminal legislature. And any legislation that says he's not accountable for his crime is criminal legislature. We don't let criminals at large in Ireland. To say that we would is preposterous, especially when they're most responsible for the integrity of the law. It's preposterous. So both those legislations are criminal legislature. It's as simple as that. And any court that doesn't carry out or feigns that there can be an absence of the Constitution to make a presumption on constitutionality is obviously refusing to do their job. Because it's the court's job to ensure, not to be guessing, but to ensure that what they conclude is in accordance with the law. So they can't do that through making presumptions, can they? No. So they're never permitted to make presumptions. So there's another unlawful in criminal legislation that says the term presumptively constitutional can be used. It can't, because it makes and renders the roles of their office inept. The removal of ambiguity as to what's lawful and what isn't. So these are three opposed legislations. They're opposed to the proper functioning of society. They're therefore unconstitutional, and anybody can see that. Anybody can see that. Very simple stuff. So this is high treason, and it's sedition. It's a serious Freemasonic, militarized infiltration and occupancy of state. They're an occupying enemy force within Ireland. Blessings in Jesus' name. If If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. For it is with the heart that one believes and is justified, and it's with the mouth that one confesses and is saved. Say it and believe it today. Jesus is risen Lord, and you can be saved from hellfire. Praise Jesus.